I should be recording. Okay. Today I'm joined with Dr. Elayne Chou. Dr. Chou is a psychotherapist practicing in the Oakland, California area. She's also on faculty at the Bowen Center for the Study of Family that's located in Washington, D.C. I'm so excited to have her here today and to talk a little bit about how she was introduced to Bowen Family Systems Theory, also referred to as Bowen Theory, and a little bit about how she uses it in her practice, the clients that she works with, and how they find how they respond to a Bowenian intervention. So, Dr. Cho, thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, tell me a little bit briefly. I think this interview should be around 20 minutes or so, but tell me a little bit briefly about how you found yourself in being introduced to Bowen Family Systems Theory, and how it landed on you, how it made sense for you, how it fit for you.
Yeah. Well, so I grew up in the Midwest. My parents were immigrants to this country. My parents are originally from China. Their families fled to Taiwan in 1949 after the communists took over, and then they each came to the United States in the early 1960s for undergrad or graduate education. At that time, they landed in Oklahoma. It was still the era of Jim Crow laws. So there was, I guess I'm giving you that context in part because whenever I've been asked to talk about myself, I always start with my parents. And I didn't really think of that as a way of understanding myself as part of a system. That wasn't the language that I got in my education, which was psychology. So I have a counseling psychology doctorate. And, psychology, I think, is a wonderful field. It also is quite intrapsychically focused, meaning, it studies the personalities and traits and there's some overlap with systems thinking in terms of like social psychology and that kind of thing. But um, anyway, all of that is to say I grew up in the Midwest and I always was curious about, the fact that I could see things from different perspectives that I didn't think everybody around me, which was like kind of the white dominant culture, um, I didn't get that sense. I got a sense that there was one worldview and I could see that worldview, but I could also see others. And so that kind of led me to my interest in psychology. I ended up in a counseling psychology background with a focus on multicultural and cross-cultural psychology, and specifically Asian American mental health. Um, and so, I've been in California practicing my work. Initially, I worked with a lot with refugee and immigrant Asian populations in the Bay Area, and then um, did some work in the counseling center at UC Berkeley with students. And then I started my own private practice and mostly work with, have a general practice in the sense that, work with people of all races and backgrounds. Um, but over the years, I've sort of narrowed it down over, the years to primarily Asian American clients at this point. And even more specifically, I work a lot with Asian adoptees, especially adoptees from transracially adopted families. So white parents, Asian adoptees, and mostly adults, but maybe some older adolescents. But it was that population in particular that I started realizing a lot of the issues that people were coming in with, they might be framing it as, something they wanted to work on their own, but a lot of what they were talking about was family dynamics. And I just got to this point in my practice after, 15, 20 years where I started realizing I wasn't doing any harm, but I felt like I could do more. And I started looking for postgraduate education that could help me. And I found, I thought back on my graduate training and I thought, the one area that I didn't necessarily get enough time in my graduate program to explore further was family systems theory. I knew family systems theories existed out there. That wasn't a part of the regular curriculum as a counseling psychologist. So I thought, let me look into that. Let me see what kind of postgraduate education opportunities there were. And I found the Bowen um, Center in DC, and I, you know, started reading a little bit about Bowen theory, and I thought, of all the family systems theories, this one seems to be resonating a lot with already a lot of things I'd sort of been kind of coming to on my own in terms of my years of experience in working with, uh, especially with families of color.
Yeah.
And and I was a little skeptical initially when I found the theory in the sense that I was invested in learning it. And, Dr. Bowen doesn't look like me. He's a white man from the 1950s. And I thought the ideas resonated. I just was sort of like, how applicable is this?
Right.
Um, and so, there was a little bit of skepticism there, but I will say that from the beginning, in part because I think people who are Bowen practitioners really do a good job of in the teaching process, really trying to do so in a way that is aligned with the concepts of the theory, meaning, really not um, imposing, right, a view, like really giving learners a chance to think for themselves, and in the way that the teaching was happening, I started to be able to observe my own um, process as a clinician, right? So getting outside of just the technique driven or, the doing of the work, but also sort of my experience as an Asian American therapist, right? Wanting to find usefulness in this theory for the kinds of clients I work with. And um, I realized that the moment that it sort of gelled for me was there's a very famous study in psychology called Even the Rat Was White, where it's essentially an article saying that so much of psychological research has been done on white people, specifically like white rats in a lab or white sophomores in Psych 101 classes, in
Exactly.
universities, and uh, and that we derive so much of what we consider to be universally applicable, from these populations, and so I had really taken that study and its conclusions as sort of a rallying call for myself. As I was out there being a clinician, I really thought of my work as my job was to translate a lot of this research and filter it, through what I know about cultural things, especially applied to Asian Americans, but multiculturally, broadly speaking, and I realized at a certain point in my studies in Bowen that what Dr. Bowen and what the theory talks about a lot is that one of the basic variables is this idea of chronic anxiety, not sort of necessarily this clinical sense of anxiety, but like this level at which, because of evolution and survival and adaptability of humans, that families have evolved over. If anybody is alive today, they're part of families that survived so much challenge over eons, right, to get to this point. And there's certainly a lot of strength that comes from that survival, but there's also residue, in terms of how the family has coped over those generations. And that carries on, in the patterns in how the family deals with stress. And I realized that for me, part of what I was bringing into my work as a therapist was a level of this kind of anxiety that I needed to be the one, who was helping my clients not be oppressed by, what psychological science could offer, but to benefit from it through this filter. And I realized I was doing too much work in that. And that's one of the things I think Bowen Theory has helped with. It's helped me calm down a little bit and let the clients own that, tell me about that. Um, I know I'm being a little vague in
Well,
how
You're
that.
you're you're great. I mean, in my own Bowen training, right? My supervisor would say, my goal for you, Steve, would be to be a non-anxious presence. So you don't, so you're not, so your emotional reactivity is not setting the course or setting the agenda for the work. And that was a great model for me to think about. And I try to explain to my students about chronic anxiety, like this is not like chronic worry. Like this is
Right.
not, oh, I'm not sure if this is going to happen or not, but it's this. It's connected. I love how you talked about evolutionary. It's connected to that evolutionary process.
Yeah.
Um, and so I really appreciate the background story and how you found this. And you used the word and it kind of gelled for me, right? And
Mhm.
I found that was kind of my experience as well is finding Bowen theory really helped solidify how I thought about the theory and how the theory pointed to what I actually do when I'm sitting in that chair
Mhm.
in front of my clients. I,
Right.
I'd love to have you kind of describe maybe a typical intervention in Bowen theory, like with a either a couple or a family members or something like that. If you
Mhm.
could describe, and maintaining client confidences and everything, but
Sure. Yeah.
describe a typical intervention, how you rolled it out, how it was received by the family, and the impact of it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I can share a couple of examples. I think one of the things that I think is unique about Bowen theory is that, while it is absolutely a family systems theory, meaning that to the degree that you're conceptualizing a client, the client is the family system, right? And I'm sure that's true for all family systems theories, as opposed to an individual, that I think it's probably a hallmark of all family systems theories that, the identified patient, right? The person who is mentioned initially as the person who needs uh, to be focused on may or may not be the ultimate, main source of, where there needs to be some intervention done. But I think Bowen theory can easily be applied in working one-on-one, and still keeping in mind the system. And so one of the first things that happens when people approach me, because it almost always is one person, right, who's doing the initial reaching out. And from the beginning, I'm sort of assessing, okay, I'm hearing what they're saying to me, and I'm thinking from the beginning, kind of, I'm trying to listen for where is the source of this chronic anxiety in the system, right? Where, and a lot of times what people present initially are what, from a Bowen theory perspective, we would consider just symptoms of the root dynamics that are at play, the emotional process that's at play. So, you know, right now, especially, I think it's very it's a common topic for people to bring into therapy because I think in popular culture it's quite big now, this concept of estrangement. So I'm getting quite a few calls, I think, from people. And so one of the dyads that I'm working with right now is a mother and her adult daughter. And the mother is the one who reached out to me and, talking about estrangement. And Bowen theory doesn't use that term. We have a term cutoff, which is just a more extreme form of distancing, which is a adaptive coping mechanism. It's a way of binding or containing chronic anxiety. But she was really upset, really wanted me to facilitate sessions between her and her adult daughter. The adult daughter had distanced because she was feeling like the mother wasn't getting her and her struggles with fertility, and so the first thing I did was really just meet with the mother and try to listen for, you know, what had happened, certainly, but not get overly focused on the topic, the content,
Yeah.
of what she was talking about, but really to stay focused on this concept of the distancing or the cutoff,
Yes.
and so asking some real factual questions about the extended family on both sides, her and her husband's sides, and then also the daughter and the daughter's husband, and just kind of getting a lot of facts, which gives you a more objective view, of the system and who's in it, and who's in touch with whom, and all of these things, and so it kind of took it out of the place that the mother was initially wanting to focus, which was on the specifics of how this estrangement had started, and what we were going to do about it, how I was going to be able to be helpful, or even wanting me to explain it to her. I really was trying to be, supportive and respectful of her level of worry, while also trying to calm that, and I basically suggested that I not meet with her and her daughter initially, in part because I heard that the daughter was working with her own therapist. And, I just didn't want to add too many different configurations and triangles into this dynamic until I was more clear, on sort of what the whole system was working with. Um, and then I also suggested the mom was very anxious about wanting to meet frequently, to kind of tackle this problem head on. And my suggestion, after kind of doing a basic amount of assessing of, there didn't seem to be anything that was a true crisis in the sense that it needed addressing that frequently. And I suggested monthly meetings.
Uh-huh.
And part of that is, that's kind of at the most every other week
Yeah.
is what I do. And part of that is because I do want people to have the time to think for themselves outside of our sessions and not to over rely on the sessions as their place where they're pulling, you know, their thinking from. And I, that alone from the beginning seemed to help calm things down because I think what I've heard her say to me is that she took from that she wasn't in as dire of a situation as maybe she was conceptualizing it to be.
Yeah.
And it did give her time between our sessions to observe because that was the charge that I gave her was to really just go and observe. Don't try to fix, don't try to make any moves. Just observe herself certainly and how she was functioning in whatever interactions or attempts at interactions she was making
Uh-huh.
and observe other people and their what they were saying what she came back with. So this is interesting because she initially thought it would be couples therapy for her and her daughter with me,
Yeah, yeah,
right? But
right.
what she came back with in terms of her observations was she recognized how much her older sister was actually getting involved. And so the older sister was actually in touch with her daughter and was actively speaking to both my client, the mom, as well as the daughter, right? And trying to broker things between them without, and my question to the mom was, did you ask her to do this?
Right,
And she
right,
said,
exactly.
no. And so that triangle hadn't even been something she'd been focused on at all
Yeah.
as contributing to what was going on. And so the first amount of work we did was really in the mom really looking at her own family system that she came from and where that triangle had played out even before this current situation with her daughter, and really thinking about how did she want to show up in that relationship with
Yeah.
her sister? How did she want to communicate about, I've got this, I appreciate your concern. And, I think it's potentially something that can create confusion, between me and my daughter about who's wanting something, who's speaking for whom. So,
Well,
that's been the first like bit of the work. And it only now, like I'd say maybe about 9 months into it, are we now getting to the point where the daughter herself has asked to meet with me? I've had a meeting with her. So now we're going to get into that potential phase of the work. But
uh,
again, I'm only meeting with the daughter initially and not together. Like there's a lot of, I think, holding for each of them, holding some space to look at their relationship without it being in the I think a lot of couples work can have the two people who are in conflict or in tension in a room together, talking to each other and
yeah,
working on communication skills. And that's not really the Bowen model. Like,
yeah,
even if they were in the same session with me, I would have them each speak to me and
yeah.
not to each other because they can speak to each other outside of the session, but
Right.
when they're with me is the chance that they have to have a third person. So this is where you have a triangle that you're purposely creating,
Uh,
but where the third person in the triangle is really trying to stay emotionally neutral, doesn't have a side that they're taking, doesn't have an agenda, right, for
yeah,
them, is just staying connected to each person, giving each person a chance to voice things, and respond to questions. And the other person's job is really to sit and listen and observe
yeah.
themselves, their own internal reactions as they're hearing that other person speak with me, right? And then they get their chance, and the other person sits and listens.
Yeah,
So
and even that, right? Even that part, Elaine, is an exercise in differentiation of self, right?
yes.
So to be able to sit there in the presence of my partner, who with whom I have some degree of fusion, right, and maybe
Mm-hmm.
conflict and whatever, but to just hear and understand that that's just their perspective, and there's nothing I can do about that. I can't
Mm-hmm.
try to make them be more like me. I mean, it's a
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. Um, it's a fascinating way that Bowen theory plays out. It
Yeah.
just to be that way. My supervisor when I was in Bowen, family systems theory training, would talk about finding the member of the family who's the portal to the system.
Mm-hmm.
That was
Yeah.
kind of his metaphor for it. Like there's one person who's going to be able. Usually, it's the person who calls to make the appointment. They're the ones with more energy
Mm-hmm.
and flow toward that work. But so it sounds like you used the mom as a portal, and it sounds like you probably had to teach her some things about Bowen theory and how to think about her family system. And then it
Mm-hmm.
sounds like she went away and observed and started to understand and right
Yeah.
and see
Yeah.
things differently.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what's been, certainly for me, because some context for the theory is that Dr. Bowen formulated this theory at a time when psychoanalytic theories were the predominant and pretty much the
Yeah.
only major ways that clinical practice was being done. And he valued it in some ways, but he didn't see it as scientific, which it
Yeah.
wasn't. I mean, Freud's views were based on concepts from literature, the Oedipal complex, things like that.
Yeah.
But Dr. Bowen really wanted to create a theory of human functioning that was aligned with scientific principles and that could be connected, to other scientific endeavors, So it's a natural systems theory, and I think that's valuable because when you're looking across cultures or across groups, there are differences, there are
Yeah.
cultural differences, but Bowen theory is looking at something a little bit different than the culture. Like, so if you look within any culture, even though everybody in that culture subscribes to the same values, there's still differences family to family
Yeah.
within every culture in terms of how well they're functioning, how well they're adapting to those values, those societal values or those cultural values. How do they implement those? How do they execute those in their family and that kind of thing? And that's what you're talking about, the differentiation of self. I think every family has its own trajectory, and every individual has their own level at which they're working on, becoming a more mature, higher functioning
You know,
person within the system.
to that end, I think I remember reading something in one of the books. I don't know if it was Family Evaluation, but or what book it was, but the paragraph started out and said, you know, ants didn't invent the ways that they are ants and the system in which ants live. Ant colonies, elephant herds, and human families. The thing they have in common is that they are all parts of systems. And so that was probably one of the most valuable things for me to kind of get my head around. Like this is a global theory of the human family, and there are going to be
Yeah.
cultural differences within, but there are also these similarities, right? If you think about a Venn
Mhm.
diagram, there's going to be this core of everything that human beings go through. And I love that Bowen theory attempts to be an inclusive theory for all of humanity.
Yeah.
There's very few theories that do that in our family therapy world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And, I think it's also a theory that really invites people to think for themselves. So it's a theory. It is not necessarily that the science or the research has been done yet to definitively validate the theory.
yeah,
That's the invitation, right? That he formulated the theory based on actual scientific observations that he made of actual families. So, at the time that he was formulating his ideas, um, he was able to get research approval, which would never happen today, to house entire families
yeah.
on a psychiatric ward
Right.
at the National Institutes of Mental Health. He was looking at schizophrenia.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a big focus of the study. So a family with one member that was diagnosed with schizophrenia would come to his attention, but the radical piece of what he was doing was not just focusing on treating that individual. He started to see that when that individual's family members, none of whom were diagnosed with schizophrenia, would come to visit, there would be a spike in the
Yeah,
intensity of the symptoms.
yeah,
And so he started to get curious about, well, what's the interactive effect? These
yeah,
people who are not diagnosed seem to be relating, there's a relationship here to
yeah.
the expression of the symptoms in the schizophrenic patient. So he was housing entire families, including the ones who were not diagnosed with schizophrenia,
Right.
on the ward so that he could observe them. And that's where, so he derived his theory from many of these scientific observations. But at this point in time, it's a theory. And what the invitation is for everybody who's interested in using this theory to inform their practice to really use the theory as a starting point for formulating thinking, hypotheses about, okay, so if the concepts in this theory are accurate, what would I predict that I would see, right, in this work that I'm doing with this client? And that can be very useful for people. So for example, I've got another couple I'm working with, heterosexual couple, living together, not married, but contemplating that.
Yeah.
And so they're coming to me because they're they're pretty sure, but they're not 100% sure. And so, that's the context. And they're not high conflict. It's not like there's a lot of issues there, but then there's just this kind of stuckness in terms of moving forward, right? And so, we're really looking at it from this perspective of like, what is happening between the two of you around, you know, what happens when one person starts to take more action, in terms of trying to answer this question for themselves. And what seems to happen is what Bowen theory would talk about as a change back response, change back mechanism, meaning like when one person starts to define self a little bit, the other person, even though on the surface that's kind of what they want is some sense of movement and not being stuck so much, that it also upends the comfortable equilibrium, that they'd sort of established. And, this tendency to want to not be pushed too far out of our comfort zones,
Yeah.
even if that comfort zone is kind of uncomfortable, you
Right.
know? And so I'm helping them to kind of look at, that and just to be curious about it, right? And to
Yeah.
not judge it as good or bad, to not judge each other as right or wrong, but to just sort of examine, what happens when a couple is trying to decide on something that may impact both of them.
Yeah.
How do you stay true to your own needs while also, recognizing that the system, the group has its needs too.
Yeah.
And how do I be 100% for myself and 100% for my partner,
Yeah.
or 100% for the relationship,
So I love
you know?
I love how you talk about it like, hey, it is a theory, right? It's not like the law. It's a
Right,
theory and it's an
right.
invitation. It's an invitation to broaden the theory, to challenge the theory, to do more research on the theory,
Yeah.
all of those things. As you were talking about this couple, this last couple, you talked about, a responsibility to self and a responsibility to the other. And sometimes people hear Bowen theory, especially people from more collectivist cultures,
Mhm,
and they'll say, "This is not for me because it prizes the individual over the collective, over the community."
mhm,
I'm just wondering, I in my mind I think about Chinese culture, Chinese American culture being, trending more collectivist, and yet
mhm,
I have a number of colleagues who are from that cultural group who say, no, Bowen theory really fits for us, for our
mhm.
people. And do you have thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think Bowen theory, more than many of the psychological theories that I studied, seems to fit because Bowen theory is not an individualistic focused theory. I think because within Bowen theory concepts, there's this term of individuality versus togetherness, that these are life forces that every system is always trying to sort between. That's kind of what I'm talking about here with the 100% for self and 100% for the other. It's not a zero sum thing. And individualism versus collectivism as cultural um, uh,
Mandates.
systems,
Yeah.
worldviews,
Okay. Yeah.
right? That you can categorize different cultures into. That is sort of a zero sum, kind of way of looking at it, meaning that like you either prioritize individual well-being over group, or you prioritize group over individual, and that the individual is expected to subsume. In Bowen theory, and I think it's easy to understand why there's a confusion because the terms sound very similar, but in Bowen theory, it's talking about how can you be an individual within a group,
Yeah.
not on top of or instead of, And it really is this kind, and this is the whole systems thinking thing, which is very much aligned with, I think, the intentions behind collectivistic worldviews. Is so I read a study recently where they were talking about how one of the differences between individualistic and collectivistic cultures is that when you ask people in individualistic cultures like Western European, American, and Australian cultures to define emotion, people talk about emotion as if it's something that happens within individuals. When you ask people in collectivistic cultures, East Asian, South Asian, African, those cultures will define emotion as something that happens between people. Okay. So there are genuine differences in how people view even something basic like emotion. But from a Bowen systems perspective, they kind of, Bowen formulated this in the 50s. He didn't have a lot of the neuroscience that we have now that sort of backs up a lot of what he was sort of theorizing about. It's saying that yes, emotions do have a physiological basis within an individual organism, an individual body, and it is highly affected by the interactions. Emotion can be contagious.
Yeah.
It can spread within a family easily. And we almost do it automatically. We do it automatically. It's not like we're choosing to or not. So even people, Americans who are, steeped in a rugged individualism
Right.
perspective of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, don't look to the family or the group to support
Right.
you or society to support you. And that even people who function in this society, you know, the science is basically pointing to that we are affected by the things that affect our loved ones.
Yeah.
We may have a reaction to that. We may choose to, handle that reaction in certain ways that are culturally specific, but we are impacted, you know,
Yeah.
uh,
Well,
by each other.
I love it. And first of all, I'm very impressed as a full-time clinician that you said I was reading a research article recently. So that gives me hope as a researcher, as a clinical researcher. So thank you so much for that.
Sure.
I've kept you longer than I had intended, and so I've loved our time together. Do you have any advice for people of color or people from the South Asian community or Southeast Asian community who are wondering about Bowen theory or
Here's what I would say. I would say there's a need for people of color in the mental health profession. Okay. Like it's important that you are somebody who is, representative of a group. Because I do think that it matters to people to see somebody who looks like them and who maybe has cultural knowledge, and that's not um, that's not all there is to helping, right? And that I think educating yourself about as many different, theories as possible is important. And I do think that family systems theory has a lot to offer for working with, groups of different backgrounds. And I think it's important um, to trust your own ability to think. So when you are skeptical of something that you're learning, there's nothing wrong with that skepticism. And to go beyond being skeptical based on something like, the founder of the theory looking different from you, right? To really investigate the concepts for yourself and to really apply them or try applying them in your practicum work or whatever, and see for yourself, what you think, and to not be afraid to voice your own views, even if they're different than what other people who have studied this theory would draw from it. And I'm happy to stay in touch. If anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to to
okay.
to speak to people,
We'll
if
put,
they
when
have
I
more
load this
questions
up
about
to YouTube, I'll just put your phone number up there.
it. Okay.
We get a lot of calls. Hey, Dr. Elayne Chou, thank you so much for being here. I know my students and the people who see this. Obviously, it's going to be up on YouTube. I think people are going to really love to hear your perspective and how you found Bowen theory and how you've implemented it with clients and things like that. So, thank you so much for being a part of this project.
Oh, you're so welcome. I really am happy to have done this, and nice to meet you. And good luck to all of your students and to
All
your
right.
teaching.
Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Yeah.